Welcome to the space. It's truly an honor to be here with you virtually online in this wonderful way to connect. I've been messaging Brock Mahi. It's awesome to see you, man. I've been watching culinary shows on television, so I'm trying to fine tune my skills there. It's really great to connect with folks that I haven't seen in some time. As it was shared earlier, I live in Bayonne, New Jersey, and this is just right outside New York City. I've done a quick share screen here so you can get an idea of where I am dialing from. The heart is where I am. New York City is there to the right, and I serve as the Mid-Atlantic Mission Center president from Binghamton, New York, all the way down here to Elkton, Maryland, east to Scranton, Pennsylvania, east to Norwalk, Connecticut, and west to Bloomsburg and Scranton, Pennsylvania. So that's where I come from. And it is a joy to be here with you and to worship in the name of Christ, the peaceful one, and Christ, the just. After listening to 22 predominantly white witnesses over 3 days of trial, the verdict of J.W. Milam and Roy Bryant was in the hands of an all-white, all-male jury in Sumner, Mississippi. On Friday, September 23rd, 1955, at 2:34 p.m., the men exited the courtroom to decide if Milam and Bryant were guilty of kidnapping and murdering 14-year-old Emmett Louise Till. Early morning on Sunday, August 28th, about a month prior, Emmett's great-uncle Moses Wright, a local Baptist minister, was awakened by a loud knock at his door. When Mr. Wright asked who it was, a man identified himself as Mr. Bryant and wanted to talk to, quote, the boy. Before Emmett could be woken and instructed to hide in a nearby cotton field, two large men forced their way into the house. The men ordered Emmett to get up, get dressed, and led him outside to a vehicle waiting in the driveway. A third voice, which Moses Wright said sounded like a woman's voice, identified Emmett as, quote, the right one. The three persons and Emmett climbed into a vehicle and drove away. Emmett's body was found inverted and floating in the Tallahatchie River several days later on Wednesday, August 31st. Officials discovered gruesome head injuries from blunt force impact, axe-like gashes, and a, quote, round hole above the right ear. And finally, a cotton gin fan tied around his neck with barbed wire. The body, mutilated, decomposing, and bloated, was only positively identified by a grief-stricken mother and a ring given to him by his father. 67 minutes of discussion, 3 balloted votes later, the jury was reseated by 3:44 p.m. Moments later, the verdict was read, and I quote, "We, the jury, find the defendants not guilty." Emmett Louise Till's lynchers were acquitted of all charges and exited the courtroom just as they entered Moses Wright's home, heirs of systemic racism. It is unknown today how many Black lives were disposed and remain undiscovered in the Tallahatchie River, let alone the countless names and stories, unnamed and untold, since 1619, when the soon-to-be American Empire first entered homes and snatched millions of Black lives to be sold, tortured, lynched, and forgotten. Black lives did not matter enough to be remembered. Mamie Till Bradley, Emmett's mother, had the prophetic wisdom, vision, and courage to display her son's broken body for the world to see. "This is not for Emmett," Mrs. Bradley said, "because my boy can't be helped now, but to make it safe for other boys. Unless an example is made of the lynchers of Emmett, it won't be safe for a Negro to walk the streets anywhere in America." End quote. Mamie Till Bradley wailed, and you did not mourn. July 2020, 65 years after Till's lynching and 401 years since the first slave ships arrived on these eastern shores, we might as well be sitting in the heat of the Sumner, Mississippi courtroom. Names, stories, and locations vary, but the races remain the same. Too many juries remain ignorant, and too few bystanders respond. Complacency rather than justice becomes normalcy. Justice experiences paralysis, unable to move and unable to breathe. This paralysis is consuming and dictating and frequently terminal. Moreover, societal equity is proven near impossible when social castes are designed and executed to restrict constitutional rights, access to basic living needs, and educational advancement, each of which deserving of their own sermon series. The coronavirus exploits the unjust healthcare system and the national predilection for economic viability. A knee in George Floyd's neck corroborates the American narrative of power over personhood. Knees, nooses, and barbed wire asphyxiate life. But white privilege and supremacy strangle life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness this 4th of July weekend. How many parents must be cried for before voices are heard? 2 millennia ago, pinned down by nails, struggling to breathe, Jesus, the Son of God, also cried out to his heavenly parent. Upon his last breath, the temple curtain was torn and defaced, and the earth shook and the rocks were split. Yet somehow we forget about the destruction in the streets and we remember the death of Jesus. But when Emmett Till, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and Rayshard Brooks' lives are taken, we condone the lost life and fixate on the destruction in the streets. Too often, I hear defensive questions and pronouncements. They shouldn't have broken the law. They shouldn't have put their hands in their pockets, used counterfeit money, or sold untaxed cigarettes. They should have learned by now. They should act like us. How much blood must be shed before hearts of stone are broken? How many parental tears must run down faces before we listen? How long must the body of Christ struggle to breathe? who else must wail before we finally mourn? In the months following Emmett's murder, the nation began to erupt. Theologian James H. Cone writes, and I quote, "The Till lynching would provide the spark that lit the fire of resistance in the Negro masses, inspiring them, as Dr. King said, to, quote, rock the nation and to demand their freedom now," end quote. Protests, freedom rides, sit-ins, marches, intellectuals, awareness, and incarceration numbers drastically increased. The intersection of justice and faith emerged as inseparable, for some anyway. August 1st of 1963, just months after Dr. King's a letter from Birmingham jail addressing the, quote, white moderates, an editorial piece titled "Our Position on Race and Color" was printed in the RLDS Saints Herald. Here, world church leaders reaffirmed church legislation from April of 1956, less than a year after Emmett Till's murder. The following was shared with those who were literate. Number 1, the church welcomes all who respond to the call of the Lord among all races. Number 2, persons of any race who are ordained to the priesthood should function freely according to their gifts and callings. And number 3, the gospel is for all mankind, and that's spelled in context. It continues, it knows no distinction of race or color. Furthermore, the piece reads, whatever their color, our members must base their decisions and their behavior on both the teachings and the Spirit of Christ. With Christ as the standard, we should not participate in extremist movements or any mob action, either for or against segregation, end quote. And I'm going to read that one more time. With Christ as the standard, we should not participate in extremist movements or any mob action, either for or against segregation, end quote, from August 1st, 1963. To call this a peace statement could be considered accurate. It's clear leadership did not support the Ku Klux Klan or White Citizens Council. Yet, to call this a justice statement would be errant and problematic. This 1963 statement advises against fighting with those seeking equality, recognition, and worth. Their freedom to breathe in society. Ironically, however, is the rationale to model the Spirit of Christ in their conduct. The Jesus we read and proclaim today is all but complicit. And when one rests in the Spirit of Christ, they prophetically seek the restoring of sight to the blind, letting the oppressed free, and liberation. The Spirit of Christ rests in the spirit of liberation. Several years later, after Dr. King's assassination, delegates at the 1968 World Conference praised Dr. King's life, but again, cautioned the church against extremism. Once more, complacency rather than God's shalom reigned. Dr. King wailed, and we did not mourn. I share these painful truths today, July 5th, a day after Independence Day, not out of resentment or to invoke or be guilty of presentism, but I share from a broken and breaking heart. Just as I am awakening to systemic issues of racism and injustice, this community, our community of Christ followers, has been blinded throughout history. Just as the church has been guilty, my charges as the white moderate are far too frequently vindicated. For this, I am deeply sorry. While I continue to discern our collective response, I find hope in our enduring principles, the worth of all persons, and sacredness of creation. When we proclaim that we, quote, we seek to uphold and restore the worth of all people individually and in community, challenging unjust systems that diminish human worth. If we truly affirm this, we must also challenge how we embody the living Christ. We must reflect, respond, re-educate, and always remember. Just as Christ remembers children in Matthew 11, the representatives of those with little to no power or place under Roman Empire, we too must remember those victimized, ostracized, and traumatized by dominant powers today. Powers that are both overt or covert, powers that are systemic or simplistic. Today we partake in the sacrament of the Lord's Supper. This symbolic practice not only revitalizes covenantal relationship with the divine, but links our collective stories, all stories in all time, stories named and unnamed. The wine and the bread that we eat are tangible reminders of a body broken out of hatred and fear. Because Paul reminds us of our interconnectedness as the spiritual body of Christ, the wine and the bread further unify us with all bodies around the world, bodies past, present, and future, bodies whole and bodies broken. Maybe today we will truly eat and drink in remembrance of this body and blood. In a few moments, we will be invited to kneel for the communion blessing. Kneeling has often been considered an outward symbol of honor, penitence, respect, and humility. Recently, though, it's been re-symbolized in some communities as an outward expression of solidarity and disruption. And if there's one thing that I know about Apostle Ron Harmon, mission is disruptive. As the invitation is shared here in a few minutes, I encourage you to consider why you kneel. Do you kneel because it's tradition? Or will you kneel for the sake of tradition, which is important, but will you also kneel for something more? Will 8 minutes and 46 seconds cross your mind as you kneel for a 26.5-second communion blessing? We must learn from our past. Church signs, field statements, Facebook posts, and profile pictures are just the start. We are beyond a time for statements and sermons. As President Beasy boldly stated in 2017, now is a time to act. If we affirm the worth of all persons, if we believe that the sacredness of creation includes humanity, we must courageously challenge systems contrary to the vision of God and name those victimized. The arc of the moral universe bends towards justice because prophetic people are willing to do the prophetic work. Educate yourself on these issues and don't rely on victims to explain it for you. Research local politics and find ways to support local movements that pursue justice and peace. The DNA of Zion, God's peaceable kingdom. Have the difficult discussions with friends, family, and church members. Listen, listen, listen. Listen to and make music of justice in the streets. And when the day's work is done, come and find rest in Jesus, knowing that Jesus was in the streets making noise with you. When we rest in Jesus, we are revitalized to move out and respond with compassion and love. The Christ-like rhythm of life is outward and inward flowing, and more importantly, constantly flowing. Through God's grace and generosity, we are all beloved children of God, and in God's peaceable kingdom, there is no us and them. Radical hospitality must replace radical hatred. Embracing arms must be the only arms we bear. This faith community, community of Christ, agreed that God beckons us to let the Spirit breathe, not to chase joggers down in a truck, strangle 14-year-old boys with barbed wire, or physically and emotionally pin Black Americans down. When community of Christ sings in the streets, we proclaim a God calling us to love and to life. This is a God who sings and marches with us. This is a God who declares Black Lives Matter. As a beloved child in Mission Center caravans, campgrounds, temples that are constructed to symbolize our pursuit of peace, and all other present-day marketplaces, you commit to proclaiming the good news, even when it's uncomfortable and the words don't come out right. You proclaim freedom to those imprisoned by sociological constructs designed only to asphyxiate. You choose to recover sight even when you are the one who has been blinded. You set the oppressed free, even if that restricts your personal freedoms. Just as a sermon is only a bunch of words, if not taken to heart by the speaker, a piece of bread and a juice cup is only calories if not symbolic. Jesus is in the streets protesting. Jesus is with the parents grieving. And today, the broken body of Christ rests before us on the communion table, just as Emmett Till's body lay before a nation in a casket. I want to leave us today with a guiding question. My prayer is that this question is both heartwarming and haunting. After kneeling for the communion blessing, what will you stand for?